Hey guys, it's Miss Johnson and I'm here to bring you our notes for Unit 4, Learning Target 4. Today we're going to continue working on the quadratic formula, but we're going to look at we're going to talk about what happens if you don't have a solution to a particular equation. So if you don't have a solution, what does it look like? Okay. So here is what we need to pay attention to. If we have a quadratic equation and we put that equation into the quadratic formula, let's say we get a negative underneath the radical, okay? If we get a negative underneath the radical, we are going to end up with something that has no real solution. If you go to your calculator right now and you try to take the square root of -9, okay, type in your calculator the square root of -9. You're going to come up with an error, and that's because you can't take the square root of a negative. The reason you can't take the square root of a negative is because there's never a time that a number times itself gives you a negative result. A negative times a negative always gives you a positive. A positive times a positive always gives you a positive. You can't multiply something by itself and get a negative answer. So what that means is we have no real solution to that equation. So then you see domain error or undefined when you type it in your calculator. So let's just take a look at an example and see what this looks like. So if I plug these into the quadratic formula, here's my A, my B, and my C. And I'm going to plug them in just like I did yesterday. I have x equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. All right, so when I work on solving that, I start under the radical first. So under the radical, 6 squared is 36. And then 4 times 8 times 5. 4 times 5 is 20, and 20 times 8 is going to be 160. So I have minus 160 here, all divided by 16. Okay, now let's do that subtraction. So when I take care of that subtraction, 36 minus 160 is negative 124. So I have opposite of B plus or minus the square root of negative 124, all divided by that 16 in the bottom. All right, here it is. Square root of a negative 124. If I try to type that into my calculator, I'll tell you what my calculator says. Negative 124. It says non-real answers. Mine even tells me it's a non-real answer, okay? So can't do it. This is not possible. So I'm done with the quadratic formula at this point, and my answer here is that there are no real solutions. Okay, there is something called an imaginary solution to this equation. There are numbers in math that have an I with them. They're imaginary numbers, but they're not on the real side of things. So when we are only working on the real side of things, as we are in algebra, we would say here that there's no real solutions because I'm not working with imaginary numbers yet. All right, let's take a look at number 2. So in number 2, my A value is 1, my B value is 3, and my C value is negative 40. So I have x equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. And then all over 2 times A. All right, start under the radical. So I have x equaling the opposite of 3 plus or minus square root of 9. And then you have negative 4 times negative 40. You don't really need to multiply by the 1. That's not going to change anything. Negative 4 times negative 40 gives me positive 160. And I have in the bottom 2 times 1, which is just 2. All right, so this one I'm adding. So this one I should be okay. I have x equals the opposite of 3 plus or minus, sorry, that was supposed to be a negative, plus or minus the square root of 169 divided by 2. Take the radical. I'm going to come up to the next column. The square root of 169 is 13. So opposite of 3 plus or minus 13, all divided by 2. And this one, like I said, I can keep solving this because I didn't end up with a negative under the radical. So I'm just going to keep going all the way to the end here. Negative 3 plus 13 over 2. And x equals negative 3 minus 13 over 2. So that's x equals 10 over 2, which is x equals 5. There's 1. And x equals negative 16 over 2, which is x equals negative 8. There's the other. So 2 solutions here. I did not end up with a negative under the radical. I had a positive, so I can take that square root. Let's take a look at number 3. Ooh, number 3 is a little tricky. Here's why. This looks a little different. So in number 3, I have 10x squared minus x is equal to negative 9. Okay, this right here should say equals 0. So before I can do anything, I need to add this 9 to both sides of the equations so that both sides of the equation so that that will go away and turn into a 0. So that leaves me with 10x squared minus x plus 9. And there's my equation that I'm going to solve. So here's my a, negative 1 is my b, negative 1 there, and then my c is 9. All right, so let's plug it in. I have x equals the opposite of b, so that's positive 1, plus or minus the square root of b, negative 1 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 10, times c, which is 9, all divided by 2 times a, which is 10. All right, so I got to start under the radical. So I have x is equal to 1 plus or minus, negative 1 squared is positive 1, 4 times 10 times 9. 4 times 9 is 36, and then 36 times 10 is 360. So minus 360 there, divided by the 20. All right, so now let's take a look at this. 1 minus 360. Check out what we get. I'm going to come up to this next column. I get x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 359 divided by 20. Here's the point where even if you don't recognize that, if you go to type this into your calculator, you're going to get an error. That's not possible. I'm done here. I know that there are going to be no real solutions. So that means that I am not going to go any further at this point. All right, let's look at one more together. So again, we're going to start off the same. We identify our A, our B, and our C. So I have x equals the opposite of B, which is positive 6, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. Start underneath the radical. So I have x equaling 6 plus or minus, negative 6 squared is 36. Negative 4 times 3 is also 36. And then 2 times 3 on the bottom is 6. Take care of this. We looked at one similar to this yesterday. What happens here is I get a 0. Now, don't let this confuse you. You can take the square root of 0. If you type the square root of 0 into your calculator, you get 0. That is a possible answer. So this isn't the square root of a negative, this is the square root of 0, which is something we can do. So I'd end up with x equals 6 plus or minus 0 divided by 6. And this is one where when we looked at this yesterday, we talked about how adding and subtracting 0 doesn't make a difference. When I split this off, I have x equaling 6 plus 0 over 6 and x equaling 6 minus 0 over 6. Well, subtracting 0 and adding 0 is the same thing. It doesn't change anything. So these both end up being x equals 6 over 6 or x equals 1. This is x equals 6 over 6, which is x equals 1. So your solution here is just x equals 1. You only have one solution, and that is a possibility. You can have only one solution. All right, so that takes us to the end of our notes for today. Thanks for listening. Watch for those negatives under your radical. That makes a difference in your solutions. And I will catch you next time.